The Anatomy of Incompatibility. Why Washington and Tehran Cannot Agree on Peace. By Ward Ethan Mercer, August 4th, 2026. Introduction. The Mirage of Muscat and Islamabad Talks. Whenever press outlets report on tentative frameworks, memorandums, or ceasefire windows brokered in Islamabad or Muscat, they treat the conflict as a simple misunderstanding, a disagreement over diplomatic phrasing that can be resolved with enough patience and regional mediation. This is a fundamental misreading of the crisis. The repeated breakdown of every ceasefire attempted since the conflict erupted is not due to a failure of communication. It is the logical result of two irreconcilable, structurally opposed visions of what peace actually means. Washington defines peace as the total, permanent elimination of Iranian nuclear and maritime leverage. Tehran defines peace as the guaranteed survival of its revolutionary state and the retention of its asymmetric deterrence. Because neither side can yield on its core definition without accepting strategic defeat, diplomatic talks do not resolve the war. They merely manage the intervals between kinetic surges. Two incompatible visions of the board state. To understand why negotiations continually collapse, one must examine what each capital requires for a deal to be acceptable. Washington's peace model versus Tehran's peace model. 1. Washington's model, unconditional compliance. For the U.S. and its regional coalition, an acceptable peace requires three non-negotiable pillars. Zero enrichment and material removal. The total surrender or export of all enriched uranium stockpiles. Free and frictionless maritime access. Unrestricted, toll-free passage through the Strait of Hormuz backed by international security guarantees. Proxy and missile containment. The dismantling of regional offensive networks from Lebanon to Yemen and strict caps on ballistic capabilities. In short, Washington's vision of peace requires Iran to voluntarily disarm its asymmetric arsenal and become a conventional, non-threatening regional actor. 2. Tehran's model, sovereign extortion and strategic survival. For the Supreme National Security Council and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, agreeing to Washington's terms is equivalent to unconditional surrender. Tehran's definition of peace requires recognized nuclear threshold status, the preserved right to enrich domestic uranium and maintain underground fuel cycle facilities, Hormuz as a sovereign checkpoint, asserting regulatory authority or levying transit tolls over the strait to monetize and control global trade, sanctions relief and regional balance, complete economic unfreezing and the preservation of its missile program to balance regional adversaries. For the IRGC, surrendering these levers doesn't bring peace, it leaves the regime entirely defenseless and economically exposed. The core non-negotiables, nuclear capability and the strait. The mechanics of the conflict keep returning to two hard, unyielding physical reality checkpoints. 1. The nuclear dilemma. Washington operates under a strict red line. Iran can never be allowed to achieve breakout nuclear weapon capability. However, decades of sanctions have taught Tehran that conventional military forces cannot compete with U.S. standoff power. The regime views its nuclear enrichment infrastructure as its ultimate insurance policy against forced regime change. Asking Tehran to permanently surrender its nuclear fuel cycle is asking it to strip off its only existential armor. 2. The Strait of Hormuz toll gate. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a shipping lane. It is the economic pulse of the global energy grid. 20% global oil transit plus sovereign IRGC tolls equals systematic global extortion. When Tehran attempts to introduce transit fees, military inspections, or conditional blockades, it is attempting to convert an international maritime corridor to a private revenue and coercion valve. Washington cannot allow any single hostile entity to hold a knife to global supply chains, while Tehran cannot afford to give up the one lever that forces superpowers to take it seriously. The mechanics of broken ceasefires, why every lull fails. Looking back at the trajectory from the initial April ceasefire attempts through the June Islamabad Memorandum, a clear structural failure mechanism emerges. Every pause breaks down because both sides use the peace process for two opposing tactical objectives. Washington views a ceasefire as a probationary period, testing whether Iran will voluntarily cease gray zone operations and open the strait. Tehran views a ceasefire as a breathing window, using diplomatic delays to relieve maritime blockade pressure, protect high-value military assets from active air campaigns, and prepare its next round of asymmetric leverage. Because the diplomatic process lacks an independent physical enforcement mechanism on the water, the moment the IRGC executes a low-yield tanker harassment or proxy drone test, the entire framework collapses back into kinetic warfare. Conclusion: the impossibility of a negotiated middle ground. This conflict did not come about because of a sudden diplomatic failure. It is the inevitable culmination of a 30-year collision course. As long as Washington demands unconditional freedom of navigation and nuclear capitulation, and as long as IRGC's domestic survival depends on holding global energy routes hostage, a negotiated middle ground does not exist. The continuous collapse of ceasefires proves that diplomatic lulls are merely delaying the inevitable. Peace will not be achieved through a mutually signed document in Muscat. It will only arrive when one side's capacity to enforce its vision on the board state is physically destroyed. The Mercer Ledger is an independent, listener-supported platform. If you enjoy this work and would like to help support future reporting and analysis, you can visit ko-fi.com/WEMercer. That's ko-fi.com/WEMERCER. Thank you for listening.